Well, today we're going to be speaking about very interesting subject matter, Gen Zs and Millennials. I never thought we had the same views on many things, but it seems like we do. Deloitte has recently published their 14th edition of its Gen Z and Millennial survey, providing key insights into the evolving priorities and expectations of the workforce's youngest generations. And they've highlighted a few interesting things. A pattern of prioritizing work and life balance has emerged from this particular survey. The phenomenon of limiting efforts in work to strictly what is required seems like another one, but also they've seen a few gaps in the work environment. Well, to elaborate on this particular report, we joined on the line by Lungile Mahluza, who is a Chief People Officer at Deloitte Africa. Lungile, welcome on the show.
Good morning, Benjamin and Palesa.
Yeah, who would have thought millennials and Gen Zs think alike?
I know, right? But I mean, I guess we're seeing, more convergence in terms of the way in which they see the world, and I suppose some of the conventions that they are challenging.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the context of this particular Deloitte
hmm
survey. It looks at these particular two generations. Tell us
hmm
why, and can you elaborate on that context?
Sure. So, as you've mentioned, this is the 14th edition. It is a survey, I think, that's quite comprehensive. It covers about 23,000 individuals over 44 countries, including South Africa. And as you can imagine, really important to understand this cohort as young professionals because they do make up the largest proportion of the workforce. And I think a lot of organizations are grappling with, what drives them, how do you, drive productivity, how do you engage this cohort of young professionals. So really important that we understand and delve into how they see the world.
hmm Talk a little bit about that particular,
hmm
centrality of that particular two generational composition in workplaces. How crucial are they?
hmm Crucial, I suppose, both as current leaders, right, and as the individuals who are taking work places forward. And I suppose, if you think about, particularly in South Africa and even on the African continent, the fact of us having such a young population in general points to why this generation is so key and central to our workplaces and just more broadly our communities and future.
What stood out for you when at the outcomes of this particular report? I know that there is one established fact that has been represented over and over again in
hmm
previous reports, which is that work and life balance. So there's nothing new there. But something that has startled me is the fact that,
hmm
they are seeing very interesting gaps within their learning development in the workplace. That was something that was very much of a standout for me. Tell us a little bit about what
Yeah.
stands out for you.
Sure. So maybe I'll just speak broadly to some of the things that have come to the fore in terms of this year's survey, and then answer your question directly. So certainly, the things that we are seeing, as you've said, that work-life integration, the concerns around financial security, those are recurring themes. The thing that is coming to the fore again this year is the idea of so-called soft skills, and particularly as we think about Gen AI and how that is transforming work. And this, cohorts of professionals really seeing those skills as being what will set them apart in terms of the progression in their career. And then learning, as you've said, as a top priority. Now, I think there are a couple of things that have been interesting in terms of this, right? So it's not so much learning traditionally in terms of, university degrees or those sorts of qualifications, but it's really the learning and development that is ongoing in the workplace. So continuous learning, um, mentoring, guidance and support from line managers. And this is where we're seeing some of those, as you refer to gaps.
Mhm.
A gap in terms of what the expectation is versus the experience of professionals in the workplace. So looking for their line managers to lean in a lot more in terms of helping them gain access to opportunities, helping them manage their workloads in such a way that that workload doesn't interfere with their ability to learn and learn on the job. And I think that what they're experiencing is that line managers, instead of, let's say, perhaps coaching, are a lot more focused on sort of day-to-day operations.
Mhm.
And that's where we're seeing the gap. But I think for me, the really interesting thing is, this move away from thinking about just a traditional university qualification as the path, and looking for more creative ways and more flexibility, and even moving towards more apprentice type skills.
That's so powerful, because I've been saying, especially on this feature, that it feels like we're moving into an area where soft skills are not just soft skills. They're becoming the hard
Yeah.
skills that we all want. And this soft skill dynamic features greatly in this particular survey. Let's talk a little bit about what this generation is feeling around those soft skills. It seems like they're centralizing
Yeah.
them as well as a key need.
Yeah, so and I'm glad that she actually used the term hard skills, right? Because I really don't like the reference to soft skills,
Yeah.
But to that point, I mean, not only in the Deloitte survey, but if you look at even the WEF jobs report, the sorts of skills that are coming to the fore, and maybe to my mind, it would be useful to link a couple of things here. So if you think of the fact that a lot of these individuals have come into the world of work in COVID, right? And the sorts of things that they're seeing as important are communication, leadership, empathy, the ability to network, even ahead of some of the technical skills. And if I make reference to that WEF jobs report, it also talks to things like, analytical skills, resilience, flexibility, agility, etc. Link that to the theme of what we're seeing happening with Gen AI. And I would probably argue that it makes sense, right? That as you see some of those technical skills, let's say for argument's sake, become a little more commoditized because of technology, that the skills that we are then almost narrowing in on are the things that, well, I would say arguably make us human,
Mm-hmm.
right? And where we're seeing the gaps and the
Sure.
need to really focus.
All right, Lungile, let's take a bit of a break. This is fascinating, this particular report. We're speaking to Lungile Mahluza, who's the Chief People Officer at Deloitte Africa. They've released what they call the 2025 Gen Z and Millennial Survey, which looks at the growth and the pursuit of money, meaning, well-being. That's the subtitle of this particular report. Looking at this particular generational groups and saying, what do they need in the workplace? We'll continue after the break.
9 to 12 midday Central African Time. On the move with Palesa and Benjamin Moshatama.
We're taking a look at the priorities and influences of Gen Zs and Millennials in today's workplace through the Deloitte 2025 Gen Z and Millennial Survey. Still joining us on the line is Lungile Mahluza, Chief People Officer at Deloitte Africa. Thank you for staying with us, Lungile. It's quite interesting to see how younger generations really want to be flexible in their work environment. And that's one of the key findings in this year's survey. Career fluidity being really important to both Gen Zs and Millennials. But what does that mean? What is career fluidity?
So, I suppose this isn't necessarily a new theme, right? I mean, if we think about just the trends that we've seen over the last while, but I think certainly the ability, even within an existing place of work, to have exposure to broad areas, so mobility within a current employment environment. What we are seeing is not that they're less ambitious, but their ambition is not necessarily to climb the corporate ladder in the same way, let's say, that previous generations have had. And really, this tightly tight interconnectedness between financial well-being, meaning, as well as purpose in the work that they do. And I do think that what we are also going to see is an increase in what we call sort of fractional careers. So not being tied to a single employer, but really having more of a, let's say, portfolio of employers that you work, for fractionally. And I think increasingly, the formalization of gigs or side hustles, even whilst employed full time at a particular employer. So I think these are just some of the things that talk to fluidity.
Well, the one thing that we've heard as a recurring theme when speaking about the workplace is mental wellness. And it seems like Gen Zs in particular have really highly influenced the workplace when it comes to mental health, well-being of workers and awareness.
Yeah, this is true. So, I mean, one of the things we've seen in the survey is an improvement in the sentiment where people feel that their organizations are taking mental well-being more seriously. This is definitely a positive thing, and I would say certainly, part of the influence of this cohort in particular. I think just normalizing the fact that people are whole human beings, even when they come to work. I suppose, though, the thing that we need to caution is that there's often the tendency to focus on the individual and not necessarily enough on what some of the systemic factors in an organization might be that are leading to, well-being concerns. So, and by that I mean, we often will focus on, the individual and, how do you manage your time better? How do you upward manage? How do you manage stress, etc. But also important to balance that with making sure that as organizations, where there's systemic factors, for instance, a function of poor leadership as an argument, or the need to actually build skills in people, that we're focused on both of those things equally, so that we don't just address symptoms, but you actually also address root causes.
Lungile, a big amount or vast amount of management and leaders aren't Gen Zs and millennials, and that gives us a gap in between when Gen Zs and millennials are the ones who are dominant now within the workplace, but they're not particularly the leaders or the managers within that spaces. Does that create a disconnect? Because I'm looking at a part of the survey that speaks about the beliefs and of millennials and Gen Zs, and the gap between their beliefs and what managers actually do. So their beliefs and lived experiences might be quite different.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. And I mean, one of the things, that I think is important is to take this balanced view, right? Because we often look at this just in terms of, Gen Z and millennials. There certainly is the need to shift on both ends. So to your point around, who are the leaders currently, I'd argue perhaps older millennials and definitely Gen X. And now think about, the average Gen X and what's shaped their worldview is, the need to be independent. And this idea that, as a manager, you kind of expect people to figure things out. Whereas what we're seeing increasingly, particularly from Gen Z, is actually that they need a lot more structure. So think about some of the stuff that's come up in this report, for instance, the desire for coaching, the desire for mentoring. So I think on both ends, I'm sort of surfacing the need to shift, both in terms of the expectations of leaders, but also the expectations of Gen Z and millennials, to make for a more cohesive work environment.
So it seems like it's a demand, right? At every time you read these reports that these two generations want something different from the older generations, right? So integrating their needs and their concerns, and also like their also personal style of how they see the space of work, can feel like burdensome maybe for businesses. How would you advise that this report is utilized and is incorporated as a learning curve? And what kind of things would you have to do to incorporate these so-called demands of the millennials and the Gen Zs?
Yeah, so I mean, I would argue firstly, just the recognition that I read in every generation, right? There's been a notion of, what the lived experience of one generation is. I mean, there've been labels that are unhelpful. that have been thrown at Gen Z and millennials. So I think firstly, just the challenging, I suppose, those views and those orthodoxies. And I think secondly, recognizing that the need to shift is actually on both ends. It's not just in terms of line managers or just in terms of Gen Z, but some of the practical things, particularly as we think about tactics around some of the things that they've spoken about, like learning, things like dedicated in-house learning programs, things like creating structure around work so that there is actually that time for individuals to engage in learning, helping manage their workloads and responsibilities, mentorship. These are just some of the practical things, access to things like platforms and subscriptions to support those learning outcomes specifically. And then things like, how do you talk to the needs around structuring work itself? And some of the things around supporting mobility, like these fractional careers, like gigs within the workplace and formalizing those. I think those start to talk to meeting the needs specifically, but also increasingly coming to the fore, embracing tech, in the form of AI and making things like these tools available for experimentation. I think organizations are going to need to be a lot more comfortable with experimenting and learning and adjusting their approaches.
Well, we'll leave it there. And I think that's a great round off to see what actual adjustments need to be made to accommodate this, but also how things need to start changing, because there are generations that are coming even beyond Gen Zs that will be in the workplace soon. And those adjustments need to start taking place bit by bit. Thank you so much for your time, Lungile. It was a pleasure unpacking this survey with you.
Thank you for having me.
That's the 2025 Gen Z and Millennial survey that speaks about growth and the pursuit of money, meaning and well-being. Of course, we're chatting there to the Chief People Officer of Deloitte Africa, Lungile Mahluza. It's now 10:30 Central Africa time. Once again, time for our latest sports news with Musibudi Makura.